Welcome to this Tutor to You Sociology topic video on global development, looking at the causes of war and conflict. One of the debates in global development is over the extent to which underdevelopment causes conflict, that is, poverty and deprivation being the main drivers of conflict within a nation and between nations. Some approaches suggest that conflict in the developing world is inevitable as nations progress, and they point to the period of the Industrial Revolution in the West and the wars and conflicts that occurred throughout this period as evidence of this. Others suggest that clashing ideologies often generate conflict, either between nations or between competing factions within a nation. Furthermore, the process of development itself is seen as a source of conflict, particularly when resources are allocated to one group but not another. One of the key theorists to look at when examining war and conflict in the developing world is Mary Kaldor. She argued that what we understand about war in the West is very different from the conflicts that emerge in the developing world. While in the West, war has meant mass mobilization of resources, the use of technology, and fighting for an ideological purpose, such as defeating fascism or patriotism. These old wars do not occur in the developing world. Instead, conflict is typified by what Kaldor called new wars. These are driven by identity politics, differences between factions or ethnic groups. They involve guerrilla-style warfare, small attacks on key targets. They are often linked to insurgency against a form of government and largely financed through exiled former leaders who rally global financiers to fund small armies. Whilst not as all-encompassing as old wars, these new wars are equally devastating to the process of development. Modernization theorists take a pragmatic view of conflict in the developing world, seeing conflict as part of the process of development. Using the Western model of industrialization, they point to conflicts throughout Europe in the 19th and early 20th century as a result of the process of nations expanding. In the view of modernization theorists, it is inevitable that nations will encounter conflict as their norms and values change to those of the West. They argue that as scientific and rational thinking replace traditional faith-based ideologies, conflict will reduce and nations will come together to move forwards. However, critics would argue that the imposition of such ideas onto the developing world is a source of conflict in itself. Dependency theorists take a critical view of the role of the West in conflicts in the developing world, arguing that the intervention of Western nations enables conflict in the developing world to exist. They argue that the use of economic sanctions such as structural adjustment policies and the imposition of free trade both enable the spread of capitalism, which in turn generates a desire for material wealth and power, whilst simultaneously denying the majority of the population the very things it promises. Exploitation through work and the import of cheaper Western goods creates the conditions for conflict, as many in the developing world remain in poverty, whilst TNCs and the elites prosper. This leads to conflict, firstly through protests, which have the potential to become insurgency. Furthermore, dependency theorists argue that the legacy of colonialism is to blame for conflict in the developing world. Most notably, they point to the Conference of Berlin that divided up the African continent between colonial rulers, failing to take into account traditional differences between groups and their claims to ancestral lands. One such example of this was the Rwandan genocide, where the minority Tutsi was slaughtered by the Hutus as a result of a rivalry dating back to the Belgian partition of the region in the 1930s. Similarly, the ongoing conflict in Myanmar dates back to both British and Japanese rule in the 1950s and has led to the displacement of almost 1 million Rohingya Muslims in the region to refugee camps and an estimated 25,000 murdered by the Myanmar armed forces. A further intervention by developed nations is through arms trafficking. Duffield suggests that many of the weapons involved in conflicts in the developing world are supplied by developed nations. As Misha Glenny outlined, the fall of communism led to the increased trade in Soviet-era weapons to militias in Central Africa and South America, which are used in conflicts in those regions. Prior to the fall of communism, there was Western intervention in many conflicts across the globe to ensure that governments were ideologically similar to those in the West. In Chile, Salvador Allende was killed in a military coup that was backed by the CIA, while General Suharto was supported in Indonesia by both the UK and the USA, despite the genocide of communist sympathisers and anti-government protesters. An estimated 1 million were murdered during the period from 1965 to 1966. Furthermore, Western involvement in the Middle East, most notably in Iraq and Afghanistan during the War on Terror, which resulted in the loss of life of millions, as governments set up in those states fought against insurgency from those opposing the imposition of neoliberal policies and Western values. That concludes this Tutor to You Sociology topic video on global development, looking at the causes of war and conflict. Thanks for watching.